To start a fire, you need three things: a fuel source, a heat source, and oxygen. Now, to put out a fire, all you have to do is just remove one of those three things. You can take away the fuel source. No fire. You can take away the heat source. Or you can take away the oxygen source. It all seems simple enough, doesn't it? Simple sometimes, and sometimes not. All fires, even one this big, started out small. A single spark or a tiny flame in the presence of a fuel source and oxygen. But a fire this big can kill. It can cost millions, sometimes billions of dollars, and it's almost impossible to put out. The best, the very best firefighting technique for situations like this is fire prevention. If everyone practices fire prevention, it can drastically reduce the chance of a major fire. Remember, it's always easier to prevent a fire than to put one out. Of course, fire prevention in an industrial environment is a good bit more complicated than snuffing out candles, but the same basic principles apply. In order to start a fire, you need three things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. To prevent fires, you make sure that all three of those things are never in the same place at the same time. Which element you remove depends upon the situation. Oxygen is the most abundant fire element. It's all around us. So, for the most part, we'll have to consider oxygen as a given and concentrate our prevention efforts on spotting fuel and heat sources. Let's take a stroll around an offshore rig, look at some potentially hazardous situations, and stop a few fires before they start. Here, in the galley, the heat sources are fairly obvious: the oven, the grill, the deep fryer. The cook needs heat, and plenty of it, to prepare the food. The trick to fire prevention in the kitchen is to keep all heat sources under control, because fuels such as grease, lard, oil, and animal fat are everywhere in the galley. A lot of cooks are kind of casual about these fuels and believe that any stove fire can easily be put out by tossing a little flour on it. But let's run a test here. An open flame, a little flour. Burns pretty good, doesn't it? And while we're at it, let's check out a common cleaning agent. As you can see, flour and some cleaning agents are really fuels. So smother pan fires with a lid or use a fire extinguisher. And check out the labels on all cleaning agents before you go squirting them around a heat source. In fact, it's a real good idea to make sure all cleaners used in the kitchen are non-flammable. Let's see, what else? Well, what about the grill grease trap? The grease trap is easy to overlook and just happens to be very close to both the stove burners and the stove's electrical wiring. Yum. Now there's a tasty fire just waiting to happen. And while we're checking out the stove, let's look at those vent filters. If they're grease clogged, there's a potential flash fire there. And when we pull off the filters, what do we see? More grease. Grease covers the whole duct system and the vent fan. A grease fire on the stove would spread to the filters, the vent system, the fan, and turn into an electrical fire that would definitely interrupt a meal or two. But in this case, fire prevention is simple and amounts to nothing more than giving these areas a good cleaning on a regular basis. But before you harass the cook about poor house cleaning, let's walk down and check out the change room. You should be able to spot the heat source here right away. Smoking is usually allowed in the change room, so there's nothing wrong here, unless the heat source winds up in a fuel source like this trash can. These heaped up oily clothes. Or this trash piled in the corner. Fire prevention in the change room is simply a matter of keeping the heat and fuel separate and keeping the fuel sources to a minimum. Don't allow trash to stockpile in corners or in lockers. Make sure ashtrays are provided and that the crew members use them. And even without an external heat source, these oily clothes can chemically react and spontaneously combust. They should be picked up and washed, which means our next stop on our fire prevention tour is the laundry room. The fuel sources you need to watch for here are oily clothes, accumulated trash, and lint. Lint is fine, loosely packed cotton. It's easily ignited with a single spark from the dryer and burns quite well. So clean the lint traps frequently. Don't allow lint to accumulate behind the dryer, inside the dryer back, or around the room. Instead, put lint in the trash can and empty the trash can and ashtrays frequently. In addition, don't allow clothes to pile up in the laundry room. Wash them and put them away as soon as possible. Fire prevention here in the living quarters is about the same as for the change room. Don't let trash and oily clothes pile up, and most importantly, no smoking in bed. More fire deaths are related to smoking in bed than any other single cause. If you're too tired to sit in a chair, chances are you're so tired you'll fall asleep. Mattresses and bedclothes are a rich and densely packed fuel source, and tough to put out once in flames. So put it out before it puts you out, but again, don't use a trash can. Put your cigarettes out in an ashtray. Okay, so far we've looked at the galley, the change room, the laundry room, and the living quarters. Let's stop right here a minute and review what we learned so far. Well, up to this point, our fire prevention tour has found a lot of potential fire hazards. Most of the hazards were created by situations and combustibles so common they could have been found in your own home, which may be why they were overlooked in the first place. But a drilling rig by nature possesses a wealth of chemicals and products that are much more combustible and explosive than the fuel sources we've discussed so far. In addition, many of these flammable materials are found in confined spaces, like this paint locker, which makes them doubly hazardous. The limited access makes escape and rescue difficult, if not impossible, in the event of fire. And flammables in a confined space increase the chance of explosion from accidental ignition. Why? Well, many flammable liquids, like this open can of paint, give off flammable gases when exposed to the atmosphere. In most cases, the gases are invisible, and some will deaden your sense of smell after a short period of exposure. With time, the gases increase in density, completely fill the enclosed space, and mix with the readily available oxygen to form a vapor. Then, all you need to trigger an intense flash fire or explosion is a heat source, like static electricity, or the spontaneous combustion of these solvent-soaked rags. In order to prevent fires in the paint locker, keep all liquid flammables in sealed and approved containers, and stow cleanup and solvent rags in a separate airtight container. Since the rags and open paint can indicate someone's been painting, let's check on the painter and see what other hazards he's created. Aha! This open can of thinner should be kept sealed in the paint locker when not in use, even for short periods of time. Although it's on an open deck where the vapors are well vented, it's unattended and could be ignited by a passing heat source, like that fella smoking or sparking equipment such as drills, grinders, or welders. Remember, keep all flammables sealed when not in use. Continuing along the painter's trail, we find this particular painter is really asking for it by using an electric drill to mix a bucket of paint. So what's wrong with that? It's a lot faster than hand mixing, isn't it? Well, yeah, but most people don't realize they're placing a sparking heat source right next to highly flammable vapors and fuel. Since most people lean over the bucket to mix with the drill, flash fires under these conditions result in severe facial and upper body burns. So why risk it? Instead, mix paint by hand in a designated place for paint mixing and cleanup. Make sure the area is well ventilated and marked as a no smoking area. Next, let's inspect the motor room. At first glance, everything seems to be in order. But motors operate at high temperatures, and generators can create sparking heat sources. Add to this the oxygen in the atmosphere, and all we need for a fire is a fuel source like this oil spilled in the drip pan. Cold oil vapors will light easily enough, but engine heat makes this oil even more prone to accidental ignition. Judging from the heavy smell of diesel in the room, there's been a fuel leak, maybe from one of these pipes, or possibly from overfill in the day tank. Flammable liquid spills in rooms like this can be tricky because the liquid can run under equipment or down to a lower level through the grating. In this case, someone was on their toes. The spill has already been cleaned up and the leak or overflow problem repaired. However, by not venting the room properly, they only removed half the hazard. A vapor fire could ignite other open fuel sources, like the oil in the drip pan, or this leaking oil caught in a bucket. Again, all petroleum products and flammable liquids should be in sealed containers. In motor rooms, boiler rooms, and other enclosed spaces, all fuel and oil leaks need to be repaired as soon as possible. All spilled flammable liquids removed immediately, and all vapors vented. Now, let's take a look at the transfer pumps. You need to pay special attention here because transfer pumps are used to transfer fuel from supply ships to holding tanks on the rig. Any leaking pump seals, excessive line pressure, or momentary lapse in proper handling of the equipment results in a fuel overflow on the rig, the supply vessel, or on the water, and increases the chance of fire. In addition, the fuel pump room is particularly notorious for vapor accumulation, which means it may be toxic upon entering or potentially explosive. So make sure the vent system is fully operational at all times. Also, be aware that certain liquids such as diesel, jet fuel, and distillate oils generate static when moved. Never load these products into a tank with an open hose because spraying and splashing these fuels creates static electricity, a very unwanted and unpredictable heat source. And speaking of static electricity, some people like to use CO2 fire extinguishers to displace the oxygen from tanks before loading them, thinking that it's a good safety practice. Unfortunately, most people don't realize discharging CO2 gives off static electricity. So keep your extinguishers charged and at the ready in all hazardous areas to do what they were designed to do: fight fires instead of starting them. Also, make sure appropriate safety signs are posted on all fuel tanks in hazardous areas. On this rig, we'll find them posted on the fuel tanks, the drilling floor, the mud pits, the BOP area, the helicopter refueling area, the shaker house, and around exhaust vents from hazardous areas and confined spaces. In all these places, this sign is put up to signal workers they are entering a hazardous area, an area where fire prevention is especially critical. It directly prohibits smoking, but it also means you should automatically scan the area for any fire hazards, such as exposed flammables, inadequate vapor ventilation, and unwanted heat sources. To prevent accidental ignition from electrical fixtures, hazardous areas need to be equipped with explosion-proof lights and junction boxes. All explosion-proof electrical equipment must bear a label signifying appropriate hazardous classification. Check this equipment periodically to ensure it works properly, but never work on an energized fixture. And never use non-explosion-proof extension cords or electric hand tools in hazardous areas either. Instead, use only explosion-proof or battery-operated equipment, especially in enclosed spaces like tanks, pump rooms, paint lockers, and fuel storage. Now let's cruise on over to dry material storage. Since there are no flammable liquids here, why should we be concerned about fires? Well, some chemical dust ignite just like fuel vapors if they're suspended in air. Some incompatible materials will chemically ignite if stored next to each other. Some dry materials are fuels themselves. And most dry materials come wrapped in a nice, combustible paper bag. Consequently, poor housekeeping is as much a fire hazard here as anywhere else on the rig. Separate each dry chemical. Store them with tow boards. Stack the sacks where they won't fall or tip over. And dispose of the empty sacks. Whew. Seems like a lot to remember, doesn't it? Let's say we pause here and recap what we've learned so far. Most fire prevention is just common sense. You know that a heat source can be a chemical reaction, open flame, radiant heat, or sparks. And you know a fuel source can be paper, wood, clothing, paint, fuel, oil, chemical dust, or vapor. The only trick to fire prevention is to keep fuels and heat sources separate in the presence of oxygen. That's easy enough to remember, isn't it? Well, you'd think so anyway, but it's a sad fact that a great many fires start with folks who have been told many times about the hazards of their job. Folks like this welder. It seems that the day-to-day routine of their jobs tends to make them careless. So, let's walk through proper welding procedures just to refresh everyone's memories. To begin with, it's a good idea to get a welding permit before welding or cutting any place other than in the welder's work area. The permit will list conditions for welding in a designated area. The welder automatically checks and follows all listed conditions and uses common sense for any that aren't listed. The welder checks his gear before starting and in between jobs. His compressed gas cylinders must be handled and stored properly at all times. Proper storage means installing safety caps, securing the cylinder from falling, separating different types of cylinders, and keeping the cylinders upright and free of oil and grease. In addition, the welder checks for leaking hoses, which not only waste fuel and oxygen, but start fires as well. And while he's working, he runs the hoses where they won't be easily damaged by other rig operations. Before beginning work, the welder scouts the area for potential hazards and removes them. In some cases, a fire blanket is required to keep sparks from fuel sources or equipment. The welder ensures a fire watch is trained, placed, and used when necessary. The welder not only checks the immediate area where his sparks will fall, but the other side of what he's cutting into.
We have good oxygen and no explosive gas, Gene. It's safe to weld in.
He also makes sure the welding area is adequately ventilated and that the atmosphere is free of flammable vapors and O2. If he's working in a confined space, he'll make periodic checks to ensure the atmosphere remains safe for welding conditions. A good welder never leaves a cold torch in a confined space, even for a short period of time. Since torch hoses always contain enough residual gases to ignite, the welder always lays a torch out on deck and cuts the fuel and oxygen off at the bottle. The welder knows some protective coatings give off flammable vapors or burn when heated, and he removes these coatings before welding or cutting. A good welder won't cut the lid off an empty drum unless it's clean, full of water, and properly vented. An even safer practice is to remove drum tops cold with a mechanical cutter. And a really good welder knows that sealed bearings and heavy machinery and drill bits contain grease that can flash or explode when heated. Well, now that we've checked out the rig from stem to stern and discussed everyone from the cook to the welder, you'd think that'd be enough. And it would be if they made a rig that never needed repairs. But they don't. So sooner or later, you're going to find yourself and your rig in a shipyard where a surprisingly large number of rig fires occur. Why? Well, for one thing, the crew is more relaxed. They don't have to work as hard, and they let the normal fire prevention awareness relax in a place where they need it the most. For instance, it's common practice to pull all fire extinguishers and service them while the rig is docked. This is an excellent maintenance practice, but only if spares are put in their place. While in the shipyard, the rig may be tied to the shipyard fire water supply. It's the crew's responsibility to check the rig fire mains for adequate pressure at all times, and to see that charged fire hoses are located in tanks or workspaces as needed. If two vessels are berthed next to each other, make sure each is provided with independent fire water supplies. Also, gas-free and monitor all work tanks at least every 8 hours and place well-trained fire watch personnel as needed. And at all times, keep emergency phone numbers posted and available to all personnel. In addition to these special considerations, you must employ the same fire prevention efforts used while the rig is operating. This means being aware of the many things on a rig you walk by every day that can explode or burst into flames. It means knowing most fires start small and they start with being a little bit careless, doing jobs easily instead of safely, ignoring common sense, neglecting simple housekeeping, having misconceptions about what is safe, and taking unnecessary risk with everyday hazards. It means realizing these small, seemingly harmless actions can quickly become